Can you hear us? I've sent you a request. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes.
So
yes.
you'll be
Hi.
translating for Professor Bello, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Welcome to
Thank
the
you.
webinar.
Thank you.
So Alvin is there. So only Joe will come in. Ravi will come in half an hour. So we've covered.
I think we can start, Dr. Asad, because we've got 7 minutes past. So
I think, Derek, you have to make Alvin, Dr. Alvin, all of them co-host.
they've been made, maybe.
No, I cannot see
already
them.
are.
No, they're not. Alvin is not, and Professor James is not.
Yeah, no, Alvin is a
came in,
co-host. Alvin is co-host.
Okay, I can't see it on my.
Alvin and James. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Done.
Okay. When you want to open up, let's start. The others will join in time.
All right. Oh, we are. I think we better start. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm admitting one.
Yeah.
Can you disable the?
Hello, everybody. This is Alvin. Thank you.
Yes.
Alvin, could you switch on your video, please?
I cannot start the video here. The video could not be started here.
Wait, I've sent you a request.
All right, okay.
Maybe just try now.
Professor Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Professor Joe.
I think you'll have to, Professor Joe is also to be made co-host.
Yes, I'll make him co-host.
Okay, shall we start?
Yeah.
People will be coming in due course. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to those from Australia. Welcome to all of you to the webinar 28 that we are going to have today. Again,
¿Podés traducirme lo que dice Russell?
the theme being biopower, the relationship between medicine and politics and its impact for public health internationally. For those of you who might not be aware, this is the 28th. We have been having these international panel discussions of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics, and this has been going on since April. Again, dealing with this pandemic, but looking at various aspects and from an ethical perspective. So today we are come to another very important area or aspect, and that is the importance that we see between medicine, the relationship between medicine and politics, and its impact on public health. So, as you know, we have the World Bioethics Day was on the 19th of October, and we did have the last webinar 27 was focused on that. And the theme this year has been benefit and harm. So we are going to continue to explore this World Bioethics Day theme of benefit and harm, but on a societal level now, and importantly through the lens of biopower. We will try to examine the concept of biopower and the role it has played in shaping public health policy throughout history. Now that's important. And questions in particular now, as we are with the COVID pandemic, we are looking at questions with this COVID pandemic and the state-enforced isolation and vaccination And further down, the relative value of human life, public health as an exercise in political power, and above all, the ethical questions that surround the politicization of medicine and healthcare policy. These are we would like to explore. Now, we have a very interesting and rich program today. The political system is the vehicle through which public health officials can achieve population-wide and lasting systems change. And from a political perspective, the vitality and economic viability of any community is highly dependent on the health of the population and indeed the effectiveness of the health system. But there is a relationship between medicine and politics, between medical management and the human body, and government management of the political body. And as we see, increasing complexities seem to happen both of society and governmental administration of society in the modern age. And this has made it quite difficult to completely separate medicine from politics. Now, while we say this is in the modern age, we're going to look back also in history and try to understand what we know from history, how this has impacted particularly in various aspects, but importantly in the public health domain. We have Professor Michael Robertson on our panel. He's a professor of psychiatry from Sydney University, and he is the author of a very interesting book called First into the Dark. And this is book goes into eyewitness accounts, records, and case files, and narrates a history going back to the Nazi regime, where euthanasia was undertaken against the sick and disabled. And in fact, it was called the word cracking board. Is that right, Michael?
Krankenmorde, meaning the murder of the sick.
Yes, that's the word that was given. And importantly here, well, there were more than 400,000, and a number of them, 300,000 people who were sick were killed, and also 400,000 sterilized against their will. But importantly, many complacent doctors and nurses and bureaucrats were involved in this. So we want to, and this book goes in deeper and reveals deep implications for contemporary society, moral values, ethical challenges, indeed in the end of life decisions. Reproduction and contemporary genetics, disability, and human rights, and importantly in remembrance and atonement for the past. I'm delighted here we have a panel of international panel from covering all the parts of the world. We also have Baroness Elora Finlay, who is one of the has a great role in the end of life decisions and much of that work with the British in the British Parliament. So I will introduce the panel we have today before and then hand it to us, Dr. Mary, to also welcome all the participants and Dr. Derek to give, Professor Derek to give the house rules. Now, we have with us Professor, as I said, Professor Dr. Michael Robertson, who is a psychiatrist and a professor of psychiatry at Sydney University. And he's also the author of this book, First in the Dark. And he will be making a presentation before we go into the discussion, taking us back into some of the history that we know of. We then have Baroness Professor Elora Finlay, who is a member of the House of Lords, but importantly, she is also part of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics program and has been on this panel a number of times. We then, I want to introduce to you Dr. Alvin Chan. Alvin Chan is a pediatrician, but he also is from the, I think he represents, he was a past president, but certainly represents the Hong Kong Medical Association and is the treasurer of the Confederation of Medical Associations of Asia and Oceania. So he hails from Hong Kong, and he's going to be a panel member who is going to discuss this. Then we have Professor Dr. Joseph Thornton from the University of Florida, who is also a UNESCO program, head of the program and part of the education department of the UNESCO. And I will go on then to introduce Dr. James Iringa. I hope I pronounced it.
Miptari.
James. And James, Professor James, is the Dean of the School of Public Health at the Amref International University in Kenya. And I'm now again delighted to also introduce to you Professor Dr. Leon Cohen-Bello, who is from Buenos Aires, and he's the president of the Argentine chapter of the, I think, the Israel Medical Association, but he's from Argentine and represents the Latin America. And we'll also have with us Professor Dr. Ravi Wadhwani, who will be joining us in a half an hour. He is the treasurer of the World Medical Association and hails from India, and he should be joining us. So we then go on to have, we have this one more panel member from Africa or from Kenya, and this is Professor Walter Giocco, who is the director of the Kavi Institute of Clinical Research from the University of Nairobi. So with that, we have, and yeah, so we have all our panelists here, and I want to welcome, I want also to acknowledge Professor Amnon Kami, the head and shareholder. I'm delighted that he is attending, and he's on here with us at the moment. So before I get ask Michael Robertson to do his presentation, I'll ask Professor Mary Matthew, the co-chair of this program, to welcome our guests and participants and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Russell, and good day to all. I'm Professor Mary Matthew. I'm a professor of pathology at Kasturba Medical College in India. I'm also the head of the Indian program of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics. And I've been moderating quite a few of these webinars that the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics, Haifa, has been holding in under the Department of Education along with Dr. Russell. And today's webinar is rather interesting because we're talking about a concept that we haven't had the word for it, but we can understand what it means, and that is biopower. And this is in line with this year's theme, the UNESCO theme for this year, that is benefit and harm. And just for those who have joined in a little late, what is biopower? It was a word that was coined by a French scholar, Michel Foucault. He was a social theorist and also a philosopher. And it is the use of power to manage human beings. So that is the simplistic definition that I can give you. And in the political context, it has been used quite frequently to control entire populations. So entire population, that is. So Professor Michael will be talking about his book, First in the Dark, where it talks about this biopower. Following his talk, we will have our esteemed panelist who Professor Russell has already introduced to discuss the various issues pertaining to biopower, especially with regard to their individual countries. And what after that, we will, Dr. Derek will be monitoring the chat box. And if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. So before I start, let me invite Professor Derek to just give the house rules before we take off.
Yeah.
Yes, good day, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Mary. Without wasting further time, just a request to everyone here who are attending. Other than the panelists, may I request everyone to kindly switch off their videos during the discussion so that we can only see the panelists on screen, and also that helps us with the quality of the broadcast. And please also check that your phone, the mics are muted at all times so that we don't have any background noise and can enjoy this webinar. So good to have everyone. Back to you, Dr. Mary.
Yeah, Mary, before I go, can I just introduce Dr. Ravi, has just joined us, and I want to welcome, he represents not only India, but the World Medical Association. And a very big welcome to you, Ravi, Dr. Ravi. As we start, I am Professor Russell D'Souza, and I'm talking to you from Melbourne, Australia. And I think this is
thank you very much.
Today's program is relevant and comes. We also have, I think, another from Melbourne, because we've just had what do you call it, a lockdown and so forth, and several questions have been asked, and this very issue is something that's being discussed, particularly from the impact, from not only from a political but from an ethical point. Several issues have come up here, and I'm delighted that this is this area is being discussed here. We do have, I think, some of our colleagues from Melbourne, doctors who have actually sent a letter to the Premier. I think 500 odd doctors have written asking for or making a note about this issue, about the mix of these two and the impact it has on public health. So with that, Dr. Mary, I will ask Michael to, Professor Michael, to go up and start with his presentation. Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Russell. Professor Michael, you may start your presentation.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. You've mentioned a book I co-wrote with Astrid Ley, who's a German historian, and Edwin Alight, who is with me at Sydney Health Ethics in the University of Sydney, who's a bioethicist. And Our book seeks to revisit the history of the persecution of the sick and the disabled under National Socialism in Europe. It's a story that's been told previously. Certainly there's a number of significant books in the 1980s and 90s that address this history, but we wanted to take another look at this particular story through 21st century eyes, and also to try and, from a perspective of bioethics, understand what it means now. So we began the process of researching the book well before anyone had heard of novel coronavirus. And our analysis was very much based on the concern to not try and make simplistic comparisons between the Nazi period and what's happening now. That tends to be a intellectually dishonest trope for many people. It's been referred to as Godwinning, to invoke Godwin's law, which argues that the longer a conversation or an argument continues, the more likely someone is to mention the Nazis, and that becomes the kind of beginning of the argument deteriorating. What we wanted to do was to look at how to understand events from the 1930s and 1940s and their significance to now. What do we have in common with the professions and the state that perpetrated these crimes, and how are we different? And so our analysis took us to biopower, or Biopower, as Foucault called it, and as Professor Mayhew correctly stated, it's a term that has its origins in the later work of the French post-structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault. Now, Foucault first coined the term biopower in a series of lectures he gave in the mid-1970s at the Collège de France. And the title of the lecture series was Society Must Be Defended. And what Foucault sought to interrogate was how the modern state exercised power, a coercive and asymmetric use of power over both the populations and the individuals in the modern state. So the presuppositions was that with the advent of the post-Enlightenment modern state, the ruling class, the divine right of kings, has been replaced by government. And so Foucault and those who came after him wanted to examine governmentality. How do governments operate? How do they control and modulate the population? And Foucault's focus in these lectures was looking at questions such as declining birth rates and how the government or the state would intervene, morbidity arising from epidemics. And obviously Foucault mentioned in these lectures not just epidemics, but viral illnesses and other illnesses that would interfere with the productivity of the population and the state. Problems of old age, how to prevent accidents and so on. So it was a wide survey of, I suppose, the study of health and the study of biology. And what Foucault, the central argument Foucault makes is that through the exercise of biopower, the modern state exerts control literally over the biology of the population. It controls at the level of life itself, not abstract concepts of rights, not abstract concepts of entitlements or policy. It is about the control over biology. And for Foucault, it's exercised at an individual level and also at a collective level, what he termed the massification of the population. So put simply, Foucault's idea is that one of the key factors in the modern state, the practice of governmentality, is to control over aspects of the biology of the population. Now, Foucault's analysis projects into the Nazi state, as do many other writers in the field of biopower. And Foucault looks at the Holocaust and genocide in general as an extreme manifestation of biopower. So the term used is that of thanatopolitics, the politics of death. And so in a sense, in Foucault's analysis and in later analysis in Biopower, genocide is the ultimate expression. The literal elimination of the biological mass is the extreme expression of state or government power. And we see it in its historical apotheosis in the Holocaust. But it's equally applied in other genocides, both ancient, modern, and contemporary. Now, the writer who takes this and extrapolates it into, I think, a really interesting but quite complex philosophy is the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who focuses on the extremes of biopower, and particularly Agamben's analysis focuses on the figure of the concentration camp victim. So the images that we see from the liberation of the concentration camps as the Allies moved through Europe, liberating Europe from Nazi tyranny. And these wretched, emaciated, half-dead survivors of camps are the manifestation of, ultimately, biopower, the state's total control over an individual. And Agamben refers to these extraordinary circumstances as states of exception, which are the removal of all rights, entitlements, privileges, or what have you, and it's just the existence of what he calls bare life, the bare existence of an individual, totally devoid of political or social participation. And Agamben then applies this analysis to modern states, and he comments in particular on the the wretchedness of asylum seekers in refugee camps in Bari, and you could equally apply it to asylum seekers in refugee camps operated by my government on islands like Nauru and Manus. This idea of the complete removal of all rights, privileges, or participation, and just an existence, a control over when to eat, when to sleep, who lives, who dies, who gets medication, who gets movement. All of these things is micromanagement of the state. And Agamben's concept of bare life is increasingly applied in a way to understand the experience of certain states of biological otherness, both historically and contemporary. So, for example, looking at Australian history, the process of the removal of mixed race children from their families of origins in a process that was termed the stolen generation is an exercise of extreme biopower, radical biopower by the Australian government until the 1970s. And it's, much of my clinical work at the moment is dealing with transgenerational trauma, and I see people that are now in their 40s and 50s who narrate childhoods very redolent of what Agamben was talking about, bare life, their existence in institutions where they're placed. And there are similar histories in Canada and in other colonized states. So biopower in its extreme form, certainly it's the original analysis is of the Holocaust, but it is extrapolated by other writers after Foucault into our contemporary state. Other writers such as Negri take a more Marxist approach and look at biopower from the perspective of, I suppose, the harvesting of physical and emotional labor of the population for economic productivity. It takes Marx's concept of surplus value and applies it to literally to biology. So what we tried to do in our analysis of the history of the Nazi persecution of the disabled is to understand a very interesting and troubling observation made by the historian Robert Proctor, that adjacent to the state policy of Nazi Germany to compulsorily sterilize the genetically defined underclass, to mass murder the disabled and the sick and those who were unproductive economically, you had a public health policy that banned smoking in working places, that looked to encourage the population to eat more fiber, to eat less sugar. You saw the sorts of public health injunctions that we just take as fundamental. Any Masters of Public Health student would recognize these as the basic building blocks, yet these mass murder and genocide. And so the question is, how can we understand this? And that's why the analysis of biopower applies. Now, in the second half of our book, we try to understand questions such as prenatal genetic testing, end-of-life decision-making, the rights of people with disabilities, particularly with the advent of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, how all these things fit together in light of this history and under this methodology or analysis of biopower. How does biopower apply to this? And how do all of these questions relate to the exercise of the power of the state? And I think the other dynamic that emerged from the late 1970s with the election of the Thatcher
Go ahead. I think Dr. Derek, could you please, go ahead.
The other dynamic with biopower that emerges with the advent of the Thatcher government in the UK and the Reagan government in the US and in our country, the Hawke-Keating government, is this infusion of neoliberal economics and the influence of the market, not only on the operation of the state, but also formulation of public policy and the critical role that's now played by the market. And so how does biopower manifest through the market? And it could be questions of idealized concepts of embodiment. What is the ideal shape? What is the ideal diet? What is the ideal appearance? These sorts of things. So whether we're talking about designer babies, whether we're talking about reproductive assisted fertility, whether we're talking about vaccines, and the confluence of market policy and so on, we see biopower as a kind of really compelling way to understand how these processes unfold. Now, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a virologist, but my observations of how biopower can inform our current situation, and perhaps to try and bridge my presentation to the panel discussion, is to say, well, how might biopower be in operation in our current context? Now, questions of lockdowns, as Professor de Souza has mentioned, is that these were extraordinarily deprivative steps taken to deprive people of their rights. It's essentially the violation of Mill's concept of negative rights. That decision is taken in a state of emergency, or as Agama would say, a state of exception, to deprive people literally of their liberty. And in some circumstances, as was seen in the early phases of the pandemic in Europe, that decision who lives and who dies, who gets the ventilator, who gets the treatments that are needed. But some of the, I think, more troubling observations, certainly say from the Australian perspective, and I'd be interested to hear how colleagues overseas have seen this, but in the early stages of, I suppose, the state's management of the pandemic here, Australia was the beneficiary of being late adopters of COVID. So we had a few months of data from the Northern Hemisphere to formulate a plan. But I think more likely than not, it was to do with the geographical distancing. We have the ultimate form of social distancing, albeit geographical, and the ability to control borders. Now, borders are an extremely emotive topic in our history and remains so. And in fact, even now, just this weekend, the Labor government in Queensland was returned resoundingly because of its management of the pandemic, and in particular, its steadfast refusal to open its border to the rest of the country. So these extraordinary things, in fact, this is seen as a huge affront to the Commonwealth, a state asserting the right, almost usurping the power of the federal government on this. And so these here are crazy times. And in New South Wales, where I live, the initial announcements made by the state premier saw the state premier standing next to the chief medical officer and the chief of police. And the optics of this are communicating that this is a form of coercion that is medically informed. And I think increasingly now, an interesting concept that Foucault introduced was this idea of what the term is dispositif, meaning the mechanism. And what he was writing about was essentially these states of exception that Agamben would later write about, being instrumentalized by the government to formulate a crisis and then impose extraordinary public policy in the concept of that crisis, in the context of that crisis. So here, the public policy response is beyond the management of the pandemic, because they have been able to either talk the medical emergency and the economic emergency either together or apart, depending on what the agenda is. But the government here has opted to use the pandemic as a pretext to manipulate through public policy, particularly funding decisions, whose sector of the economy will survive and who won't. In the same way that the decision is who gets the dexamethasone, who gets the ventilator. In here, it's a question of who gets the funding. Even in the university sector, a long-held right-wing agenda to nobble the liberal discourses in our universities has seen doubling of the fees, or a halving of the support for humanities studies and a doubling of support for STEM degrees. So the idea of trying to mute critical analysis and just create a population of tradesmen and scientists who don't question, who don't enjoy political satire or whatever, there is a particular agenda there. There's been discussion in many economies about the pink recession and the sort of gendered nature of decision making, which sectors of the economy are supported, which are not. So whilst I think I'm starting to stray a little off my disciplinary perspective, one can see that the coercive exercise of power by the state through the pretext of biology is I think seeing its full flourishing in the pandemic. And I think finally, one of the questions I think the panel is going to engage with is this question of the emergency and the need to rush through treatments or a vaccine or whatever the particular intervention is, and literally the control of knowledge, which kinds of knowledge will predominate. Now, I think the historical analogy of greatest significance is the HIV example in the 1980s and how that was politicized, and in particular the rush through of prototype antiretroviral medications and some of the problems that came with pushing that through. And one is left to wonder whether vaccines may have a similarly torrid experience. And again, these are all manifestations of biopower and the values imposed upon decisions taken by the state. So with that, I'll hand back to Professor Matthew and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Michael. Before I go to the others, I'm being the devil's advocate here. Would you think that for Australia, it was done for the greater good, the lockdown and the quarantine measures? Because across the world, Australia has been praised for managing the COVID-19 pandemic through its strict measures. So do you think in this case, is it really biopower, or is it for the greater good?
Well, I'd actually defer to our friends across the Tasman on that. I think that the New Zealanders had a much more successful experience, admittedly a smaller population and perhaps a less ideologically driven government. I think that the premise of your question is that biopower is a bad thing, and it's not. It is an observation of this is how the modern state operates at the level of control of biology. I think the value of trying to apply this as a means of analysing what's happening is how power is exercised, on what means it's exercised, what pretexts or justifications it's exercised, and what are the limits of the exercise of that. And that starts to stray into much more complex questions in political science that I'm not prepared or capable of answering. But I think the success enjoyed by the Antipodes, and I think some of the smaller Asian countries that were able to control it early, was very much I think a process of, some of it was luck, some of it was geographical, some of it was, you know, having a functioning public service that could advise governments and governments that would listen. But I think we don't have to say biopower is a bad thing. We just have to say this is a process that happens all the time. We're just seeing it in its most dramatic, exceptional circumstances in the pandemic.
But do you think it was abused or used in excess, Professor Michael?
I don't think the lockdowns necessarily might have been. I think most people who I think the lockdown is one thing. It's more a case of what's the so-called reconstruction that's going to happen, the sort of public policy decisions that are going to follow the I suppose the subsiding of the pandemic here, and ultimately when this does in the US and in Europe. I think the kinds of public policy decisions that will be driven through the biopower analysis are going to be, I think, where there are going to be problems. I think the economic agendas here are particularly disturbing, and I think there will, depending on how things go next week in the United States, the agendas there may become extremely problematic as well. But I think it's all about this exceptional state that we have, where the government is controlling the biology of the population and how it relinquishes that control. I think so. That's to answer the question is, ask me in 12 months.
Mary, from Victoria, what you're asking, there was a need for that lockdown at a point, but then it went on, and then there was this issue of moving Parliament to change the Constitution to have 18 months from 6 months, and of this emergency, what we're talking about, without, you know, where you have extraordinary powers to use this. And
yes,
of course,
Professor Russell, the thing is, wasn't it for the good of the society?
Well, that's where the question came, because we had a very small number in the end, and there was a big factor in for example, there's a 30-40% increase in mental health issues. There's been a fall in cancer screening. So again, we have to value. At one point it was, but then it went for 110 days, which had at the cost of this there were others. So this was the question that was being put forward, and we certainly even in the last 4 weeks it was not even 20 odd cases. So that was why the people were getting. I think and the government has also acknowledged an increase in mental health, and then all the other things which we know of, violence and domestic violence and all the other things.
Right.
But certainly that prolonged period, and now it has come out. It's probably the strictest, harshest in the world.
Yes, it is. It has a consequence, yes. But,
no, but
my question is, whether do you look to it as a biopower, or is it just for the benefit of the society?
Well, that's a question, isn't it? Society is asked. Society is questioning this, isn't it? Because you say it's benefit, but there's mental illness, there's distress.
Correct. I agree with the consequences of the lockdown and quarantine, but was it?
But
yes?
I think there's a dichotomy that you're arguing I don't think actually exists. I think the decision to implement a lockdown was an exercise of biopower, as any future decision to mandate vaccination, or who gets first use of vaccination, or what processes are shortened or sidestepped to rapidly produce vaccination. So all of these things are manifestations of biopower, but biopower is not even, genocide is bad, involuntary sterilization is bad. There are bad things that are done through biopower, but there are also very positive things. You could argue that vaccinating children against
correct,
rubella or against mumps is
totally agreed. Agreed.
Yeah, so I think that what we're trying to say is how the situation is managed needs to be seen in terms of the coercive power of the state in controlling biology. That's it. I think in terms of good or bad, those things fall underneath the umbrella. There are good aspects of biopower and there are not so good aspects of biopower. You could talk, take the conversation sideways. You could say, well, in Iceland, prenatal genetic screening of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome pregnancies has almost eliminated Down syndrome from the population. Now, for many might say that's a very positive thing, but there are people living with Down syndrome in Iceland who feel quite different about that as a decision because it casts a shadow over the value of their lives. So I think when we're talking about a biopower or biopolitical analysis of a public policy decision, we have to not think in terms of good or bad, but rather look at the values that are being applied by the exercise of biopower.
All right. Thank you, Professor Michael. I'll go to Professor Alvin. Professor Alvin, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can. Professor Alvin, a lot of political issues during the COVID-19 pandemic in Hong Kong. Was
Yes.
Was it beneficial to the society in Hong Kong? Or was it the decisions made by the government? Was it beneficial or was it,
Right.
harmful?
In Hong Kong, the government have been exercising some emergency law when they enact some mandatory measures. Hey, for example, the mildest thing like the universal masking, mandatory universal masking, indoor and outdoor. And then there are also measures to limit the social gathering, number of people less than 4. And then also there are a lot of measures to close down some shops or restaurants when the pandemic is at its height. So of course, these all limit the liberty of the citizens. But then I think the society relatively take these measures with, I think, acceptance and not really think that we don't have the lockdown in a way. So we don't really object too much of those measures. So we have at one time a very controversial measure that we would have a a universal community testing project, but which is not mandatory. So, but that also had caused some objection from the political parties. So I just wonder, so sometimes those objections or the effects of the biopower are in fact balanced by different political parties as well. And then the medical profession seem to be sardined between those different political powers in the society to get the policies crystallized. So sometimes the medical doctors would give the medical advices and be smeared by different political camps to be, stigmatized as oppositionist, or they were just blindly supporting the government measures, etc. So I think that's a difficult point where even medical experts speak from their professional expert views could be stigmatized, smeared, and reputation being tarnished. I think that is not good for the society. But then, of course, we could not demonize the government all the time for making some draconian measures in the name of control of the pandemic. So I think we have to speak from our professional, autonomous experience and expert opinions, disregard of the pressure from different political parties in the society. well, especially the Western medicine had been attacked by different parties to be monopolizing or, being the big boss in the health policy making. So the Chinese medicine practitioners, the alternative medicine practitioners, you could say that they were not really accepting the position of the Western medicine. So I don't know in other societies how the citizens view the other medical practitioners. So say in the Western world, there are many naturalists who are anti-vaccine. And in Hong Kong, this is not a big power. But then many of the people just trust the Chinese traditional medicine as well. And so when it comes to politics, it's a balance of all the views of the stakeholders and so-called the benefits of all the stakeholders. Then how can the medical practitioners or our profession assert our view with evidence and science? I think that is also an art, so that people won't be antagonistic to the medical views from us.
Yes, because we've heard around the globe where leaders need to listen to also the medical profession and their opinions before taking policies which are related to COVID-19, the pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Alvin. I'll go to Professor Joe. Professor Joe from Florida.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Morning, Professor. Your views on biopower in USA? Has it been?
Well, the USA gives many examples of all the extremes of how the power is used and enforced. I guess it's well known there's controversy between our president and administration with its own public health branches,
Yes.
so that they haven't in fact taken over most of the public health direction to the extent that they can. And if they continue in power, they have plans to take more of it by removing civil service protection for the scientists at the NIH. There's diversity among the states on how the power is exercised. So California is very strict, and their data shows that they have less impact, relative impact for their population. Other states are antithetical to any type of public health restriction, and they're showing impact of the virus. Some states like Texas tried to leave it up to the individual to social distance and to wear a mask, but as their hospitals became overrun, they tried to catch up and impose strict limits. So we haven't found the right balance, but we have experienced everything that people have described, from demonizing the scientists towards not fully appreciating the impact of the restrictions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Joe. May I go to Baroness Finlay?
Certainly, thank you. I think
Are you able?
we're heading
go ahead.
to a national lockdown. But we have got public health on the podium at each press conference with the Prime Minister or with ministers. There has been financial support for businesses. And I think the government have recognized they have a duty of care to all citizens. And the difficulty they're faced with is as the numbers go up, the hospitals will be swamped, and then nobody will get cared for properly at all. So the numbers have got to be kept down, and that means breaking the chain of transmission. So a government acting responsibly must look at the science and say, what is the science telling it? And it may have to abandon its own political dogma in order to look after its population. And I think perhaps we may have seen that not perfectly in the UK at all, but better than in some other nations.
Yes. So do you think there is actually a lack of will more than, exercising power? Is there a lack of will to enforce certain public measures?
I think to enforce the public measures to stop people being free to go out and do whatever they want went against the political philosophy of the government, but the government have recognized the duty of care to the whole population and realized that they have no option than to go into lockdown, because otherwise the health services will be completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, no, the thing is, Baroness Spidley, the thing is, it's a question of exercising power, but at the same time, if you don't also do anything, that's also quite fatal.
Oh, I think in exercising power, you have to protect your population.
Yes.
That has to be your prime motive, not power for power's sake, and not power to follow some political dogma.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Professor James is there from Kenya. Professor James? We cannot see you. Professor James?
Yeah, I'm sure now you can see me.
Yeah, please leave your video on because we don't know whether you're there. Professor James, I'm talking in the context of Africa. Are there anything, do you feel that there is a lack of will in Africa regarding the public health, measures and by the political system?
Yeah, let me talk on behalf of some parts in Africa. And I want to start with my country, Kenya, where, let me say in Africa, different approaches were used to tackle this problem. And there are some countries which very few picked on total lockdown, like Uganda. There are others which picked of completely ignoring even restricted movement, let alone even lockdown, like Tanzania. And of course, they even went ahead politically to make it like it wasn't a serious problem. It was meant to bring some of them out of power because their elections, of course, were around the corner. And we would see even some figures not even being announced. There was no monitoring of the figures, no testing was taking place. But when you come to Kenya, where I am, is where I think I saw things quite in a very organized way, where there was a team which was formed by the president. It's an emergency response team that was advising the president and of course, various ministries like health and education on what to do. And this is where we saw different also approaches being used actually, where first there was the development of a regulation, public health regulation on prevention of COVID-19. And of course, even the regulations were subjected to public participation, which was very good because the public was meant to understand that the measures that were being put in place were not to punish them, but were really to protect them from the disease or catastrophic outcomes. And arising from that one, various interventions were used. Of course, like face mask was a must in public. And even as we're talking now, if you go against it, it is 20,000 Kenyan shillings. I don't know how much it translates to dollar, but it's around 200, I think, dollar, which is quite a lot. Then, of course, the worst, which made actually Kenyans to be a little bit uncomfortable, is when our country, Tanzania, next country, Tanzania was not reporting anything. So Kenyans thought actually, and because there were no figures coming in that it was even declared the COVID-19 free country, and our neighbors here, the country thought, some population thought that we were being punished for their businesses not to run, because most of their businesses were closed down, schools were closed down, churches were closed down. This is how it went in East Africa, but I think it was beneficial, because when some of those measures were put in place, especially curfew, which is a lockdown, which is restricted for a few hours, and especially at night, and then some very social gathering areas were stopped. We saw actually the curve coming down, slightly down. Well, it flattened, of course, a month ago, but later on now, we are in the second wave. But the only problem where the Kenyans are not comfortable is where Tanzania, there are no restrictions, nothing is being reported. Some people feel like even traveling to see what is happening.
Okay.
And where actually you find even the president was doubting that COVID there is no COVID, because even purpose and the goats are testing positive. But it's because actually that's an issue of politics fighting public health, because certainly it was about the rapid tests that were used to diagnose COVID-19, which were of raw sensitivity and specificity, but the politicians took it the other way. I think basically those are the experiences we have seen in some parts of Africa.
Yeah, I think there is a disparity even within the country. There probably, I mean, this may be a global thing that certain parts of the country were not reporting cases, and certain parts had a very high number of cases, so kind of stigmatizing a particular state in a country. So that was happening. But I think world over, there's election going on, you know, and that has played a very important role right now in the COVID-19 pandemic, and how issues are being fought. In fact, in India, we had certain, which I'll come to later. I'll address it to Dr. Ravi. Professor Walter, would you like to contribute to what Professor James had said? Would you like to add? Can you unmute yourself? Okay, I've sent you a request. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think for Kenya, there's a little bit of a contrast, because the COVID situation was very well handled by the Ministry of Health, but the implementation of the lockdown falls under different ministry, which is the Ministry of Interior. Okay. And police are used to force when they are told to implement lockdown. The language they understand is that of force. And I think that is where the problem is. So we have situations where people were being brutalized for not obeying the government orders, like the curfew that has been mentioned. If you're found outside your houses within those hours, the tendency was for the people to be forced brutally. And that is where the human rights issues and the issues of ethics became a problem. And then remember also, in a situation like a country like Kenya, where a majority of people are self-employed, so locking down people had its own social consequences, where people did not have food, people did not have sources of income, and the government is not resourced enough to cushion people against such eventuality. So those were the issues that faced us as a country. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Walter. May I go to Professor Ravi, are you there? Professor Ravi? Yeah, thank you. Can you see us? Can you, I'll send you a request. To unmute.
We'll make them also.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think you're muting. Yeah. Professor Ravi, one thing I just want you to explain. It's not clear. It's not clear. It's not clear. Okay. Can you speak? We'll come back to Professor Ravi. I'll just go. We'll just move on, but I will come back to Dr. Ravi after he gets back with us. I'll go to Professor Bello. Professor Bello, I'm moving on to the issues of vaccine. And, what has happened in the world is now there is a political race to find the correct vaccine. The country that gets it is probably, is going to be the winner in many ways. I've sent you a request, Professor Bello. Yeah. So can I have Ariel on the screen also? Ariel will be translating for Professor Bello. So the question is, the first question is, has the race to obtain, distribute, and massively supply vaccines become a political struggle rather than a scientific one? This is the question that you wanted to address. So are we looking now, is the issues of vaccine now a political issue? And, or is it, is it for the, for science?
Okay, I think this is a rhetorical question. Ethics must always guide both science and politics. It is a permanent tension in which the best balance must always be so. It is the task of those of us who dedicate ourselves to bioethics to find ways to incorporate this issue into scientists and politicians. Politics must always be at the service of the people, at least that we who want to continue living in democracy believe, which despite being a system with many defects is the least bad of all government systems. The father of modern sociology, Max Weber, spoke of the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility. In this moment of uncertainty, we observe that politicians are not generally acting with the necessary ethics of responsibility. It is possible that in many cases they have altruistic convictions, but the results seem to show that the way is not found. In this situation, science cannot necessarily become the driver of political activity. It must be at the service of everyone's interests, and that is necessarily a political action.
Okay. Okay. Ariel, would you like to add on anything from Professor Bello?
No.
No. Okay. Right. Okay. He made his point clear. Thank you, but stay on. All right.
Thank you.
So the question of vaccine now, there's something that people are talking about, which is called national, a vaccine nationalism. That is, countries are buying out vaccines for their country, as a result of which countries who cannot afford the vaccines will be left back. Now, as of today, if you look at the papers, it says that USA, UK, Germany, France, and I remember one more, I can't remember that country, has already have made agreements with the pharmaceutical firms to buy out the vaccine for their country. I want your opinions on this, Professor Joe. Professor Joe?
Yes, again, it reflects the ethos of the current administration. Their policy is America first, and even within America, their policy seems there's a lack of trust on how they make decisions, that they're not influenced by financial gains. But yes, the current administration policy is America first. They see it as a competition. They see it as necessary for their power base, and they will attempt to monopolize the vaccine.
All right. Okay. Baroness Finlay, UK.
I think that the UK has certainly invested a lot of money in several of the vaccine streams that are being developed. Again, the motive is to ensure that the frontline essential workers can be vaccinated, the people at highest risk could be vaccinated. And I think there is also a big debate here about the duty on the international stage to be able to share vaccines so the most vulnerable can access it. Yes. But at the end of the day, I think it will be our healthcare workers and other key workers and people at particular risk who will get it first. And it will take quite a long time to roll it out. And I think we must also remember that we don't know how long a vaccine will provide protection for. So I worry that it's being used as a political bait, almost like a sweetie, to say, here you are, we've got the answer, when actually the public don't really understand that the most important thing is to avoid cross-infection. And that means wearing a mask, maintaining physical distance of at least 2 meters from people, and rigorous hand washing.
Yeah, but Baroness Finlay, don't you think developed nations have a responsibility to the countries that are developing or cannot afford the vaccines? Because
yes, I would agree with you completely, Mary. But even then, when you roll it out, you have to have a prioritization to say who gets it. Otherwise, what will happen is it will just be the rich people in a country that get it, and the frontline healthcare workers won't. And if you don't have the frontline healthcare workers,
that is within the country. That is within the country, yes. But what I'm saying is, what about the others in the world? If all rich, well-to-do countries buy out all the vaccines, what will happen to the countries who cannot afford?
I don't think many of the rich countries can afford it for themselves anyway. And I think they also recognize, just as HIV drugs, eventually the price came down and that was shared across the world, that actually that is a duty to do. Otherwise, you have a continuing reservoir of infection going on in other parts of the world. So it may seem generous to share it across the world, but it is also in the interests of the developed nations who have the money and the resources to share it, because you decrease the world reservoir of infection.
All right, okay. So let me just go to, do we have Professor Ravi back, or have we lost him?
I don't think he's here.
He is not there, okay. So I will go to Professor Walter and Professor James also, because what is happening right now in India, we are also running, certain states in India are having elections. And they have promised the people of their state that they will get the vaccine. So these kind of false promises, is coming to play when it comes to vaccines. Professor Walter, how is it in Kenya? Because we don't know when the vaccines are coming out.
Yeah, thank you. So we are in a similar situation. We don't know when the vaccine will come out, but Kenya is participating in one of the frontliner vaccines, jointly being conducted with Oxford University. And one of the things that we are hopeful as a country is that, the principles of access to any product that you participate in a research in clinical trials, we are hoping that when it comes to the table where we are sharing the benefits of this research, should it be found to be an effective vaccine, that Kenya will be in the priority list for access to this vaccine if it's found to be effective. But you see, that only puts us on the table for one vaccine. There are many vaccines that are being conducted, clinical trials being conducted on vaccine, and we don't know which one will be effective. And so we seem to think that we have an advantage that we are participating in HIV vaccine, in COVID vaccine research, but you're only participating in one. The ethical issue also will be if we have access to that vaccine, the question will be who will be prioritized. And there have been discussions of prioritizing the elderly, the people with comorbidities like diabetes and hypertension and so on.
Do you think the politicians will get it first, Professor?
Yes, in a country like ours, I cannot rule out the politicians getting it first, especially if they fall into that category of the elderly, and most of them are elderly, and with people with comorbidities of hypertension and diabetes. I can foresee a situation where they would prioritize themselves.
Okay. Professor James?
Yeah, just as he has just said, well, in Kenya, we Kenyans are quite eager. They are quite eager actually to see the vaccine work. However, the only doubt is why it was brought for only testing in Kenya, not other places. And of course, who are to benefit first, those issues are there. Then there are also other issues of the developmental stages have been coming up very quickly because, development of vaccine takes quite a long period, but this one being last year to be tested in the country. This is where the politicians are really in some doubts. And at one point, I remember the Oxford vaccine, Britons were not actually keen to have it tried in their country. Then the Kenyans were asking why then tries in Kenya. So those were the issues. Those were the issues, and those could be also the issues within other African countries. Because in Kenya, in Africa, we are mainly consumers of these vaccines. We rarely develop vaccines. So, but we participate in the trial of those vaccines.
Okay, right. Thank you. Professor Alvin? Professor Alvin?
Hi.
Yeah. Regarding the vaccines and the politics behind vaccines, is there anything in Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong is only a very small potato in the world.
Okay.
And in the past, even the flu vaccines, epidemic flu, seasonal flu, the vaccines are not allocated enough for the Hong Kong population. So this time, of course, China had promised to have produced enough vaccines for the developing world, they said. But Hong Kong is not guaranteed to have enough vaccines next year. I heard that the government had ordered vaccines from 3 different companies, I don't know whether an adequate amount will be guaranteed for Hong Kong people. On the other hand, in Hong Kong, recently, people have been scared by the side effects, of the Sanofi virus vaccines in Korea and Taiwan. Some mortalities following the vaccination, although the cause-effect issue is not clarified at all. But even Singapore has stopped using Sanofi and the Korean-made vaccines temporarily. So in Hong Kong, some people, I would say many people, had read the news and they were scared. People were susceptible to such rumors or unfounded. At least it's not really confirmed to be caused by the vaccines yet, but people already would think for the worst. And if such issues persist, I think in Hong Kong there might be resistance from the citizens to take the new vaccines which would not guarantee perfect safety, because even there is safe results from the third stage trial. You don't know about the post-marketing results, right? So I think that is one issue that we are worried about.
Okay, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, I think the medical specialists who are advising the government and the public, including the Hong Kong Medical Association, we have been trying our best to convince the public and the citizens to stay calm and to be evidence-based and don't just believe in those early suspicions of the problems of the vaccines. But, you know, the public is easily having hysteria from those scary news. So I think the medical scientists and the profession need to advise the government how to deal with such such emotional response of the society and prevent irrational response to some medical news or about the vaccines. If we really believe in the effect of the medicine, we have to make sure that the public really have to have the normal or the right perception rather than just believing in the rumors.
Yeah, because there's a question in the chat box, if all of you have noticed, it's regarding, this has been circulating on WhatsApp for a long time, regarding the interference of the vaccine and on our DNA. Now, I'm not a scientific expert. I cannot explain that, but I have seen that on WhatsApp you know, about the vaccine interfering with the, you know, our DNA. Does anyone have any idea regarding this? No? Yeah, I think it should be addressed to someone who's really doing work and how, but I have seen this question. So thing is, I want to go to Professor Bello. Professor Bello, you had, you know, this question was for you, that is ethical criteria being sacrificed to win the race for vaccine? Professor, that question is the ethical, or are ethical criteria being sacrificed to win the scientific race for vaccine? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Do I translate?
Yeah.
I don't understand clearly.
¿Te traduzco?
Ariel, sí, sí.
La pregunta es si se está sacrificando un criterio ético para llegar a la carrera científica por la vacuna. Si se está dejando de lado como la ética.
Yes, I think so. Yes, yes. In the last question, I explain this concept. The race for the vaccine is no respect the ethical criteria.
Okay. Can you tell us what is it, why is it, what is the unethical part of it?
¿Cuál es la parte no ética de eso?
The politician, traducirlo, Ariel, los políticos tratan de conseguir rápidamente resultados.
The politicians are trying to get results very quickly, very fast.
Okay, they want the results fast. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I address Professor Michael? Are you there? Okay.
Yep.
So you've been hearing the, do you think we're sacrificing a lot of our ethical values in this race for vaccine?
Well, I think it depends on what you refer, I mean, what you believe ethics to be. If you are abiding the values that you always had as a society in responding to this crisis or any other crisis, I think you have to apply that to this decision. So the example, say in Kenya, where there's been this sort of trade, shall we say, participating in the treatment trials with some expectation that that will leverage availability. That's obviously how things are, that decision's been taken. That's consistent with how things have always been. I think the mistake again is to perpetrate a category error and say that ethical and legal are one and the same thing. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes laws are formulated and applied out of practical necessity rather than necessarily something that is, would be in itself considered a moral decision. So the decision to lock people down to prevent the spread of the virus could be seen by some as ethical because they take a utilitarian view and think, well, the greater good served by that. Other people whose businesses fail or whose marriages fall apart or who become victims of domestic violence or whose breadwinner commits suicide might not see these decisions as ethical. So I think it's a difficult question to answer globally. All ethics are local. They're all and very contextual to culture and history.
Okay. Professor Joseph, Professor Joe?
Yes, yes.
Do you think our values are being compromised in this race for getting the vaccine? What is happening to the society and to all of us?
Well, first of all, I'll just address a nuance. I think the ethics are based on the nuances of the science or the location. I'm not sure that I would embrace that all ethics are local because there's some values. And like, for example, if we adopt the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics, it provides some groundwork for us to have these discussions. In the US, we see pressure for deadlines for the vaccine, and there's concerns that we've not followed the process for safety. So who takes the risk when we do it that way, and who gets the benefit? The benefit will go to the winner. The short-term benefit will go to the winner of who can get the vaccine distributed. The risk will be borne by people who get the post-marketing side effects that may occur, or the less effective efficacy of a vaccine that's brought hurriedly to market. Also, is there an element of trust and track record that the developed nations will follow through and actually provide the vaccine to the host country where the tests were done, and will it be fairly and justly distributed? So those are always challenging, but they're based on the facts and the people who have the power to make the decisions.
Okay, right. So Professor Bello, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes. Ariel, en Argentina se está corriendo una carrera demasiado rápida para comprar muchas vacunas que aún no se han terminado de probar.
In Argentina, we are having a race for buying vaccines that are not already tested.
Yes, that's what, because there is an agreement between countries with some of the pharmaceutical companies already.
Dice, es un tema de hay países que no tienen todavía desarrollado la industria farmacéutica para producirlas.
En este momento se ha anunciado que para primeros días del año próximo vendría una vacuna rusa, pero nadie sabe qué pruebas se han realizado.
At this moment, they have announced that for the very first days of next year, a Russian vaccine will come here, but they don't know if it has been tested.
Okay, right. Yeah. That's a Sputnik vaccine, I think, which India also has a collaboration, an agreement or whatever collaboration. Yeah. Baroness Finlay.
Dr. Mary, I think Professor Walter wanted to answer something on.
Oh, I didn't see.
vaccines
Did you? Okay,
because
sorry. Okay.
He's there with the vaccine trials.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I personally do not think that the ethical principles being breached in hastening the process of getting a COVID vaccine, as long as I think speed does not mean that it is unethical. If you're able to get a vaccine quickly, it does not necessarily mean that it's unethical. As long as the processes are followed to the letter, it is only that is hastened. And WHO has developed guidelines on ethical conduct of research in an emergency situation. We honestly cannot expect the timelines that we have for developing a HIV vaccine to be the same timelines that you would use to develop a vaccine for a condition, a pandemic that requires a very quick response. So for me, as long as the ethical principles and guidelines are followed, speed on itself does not make something unethical. And we have an experience in Africa, for example. We developed an Ebola vaccine.
Yes.
And during that time, we did not hear the noises, the concerns that are being raised now, because this is a global pandemic. And sometimes you wonder whether it is okay to do it in a situation which is solely found in Africa. But then when it is occurring globally, hastening to develop a vaccine becomes an ethical issue. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Walter. There is, because I just want to say that there is something called a COVAX policy facility where 79 countries have signed, has agreed to help 92 other underdeveloped and developing countries. So there is some sort of policy and some sort of gesture on the part of certain developed countries to help underdeveloped countries. So that is a good part of this vaccine that we are looking. There are countries that are willing to help and share. So that is good. But our main theme today was on biopower. That is the effect of politics on managing people, or it may be good or it may be bad. I'm not sure we have addressed many of the issues because I think this is a very sensitive issue, and I don't want to bring up anything that would harm any of the panelists. So certain countries have policies which may be where you could see it as exercise of power. But like I said, even not exercising power or ignoring what is happening in the country in terms of COVID-19 pandemic is also by itself, another aspect of biopower. So in this COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen all this, the effects of, some of them, like I said, may have been for the good, like lockdown, quarantine, but we have seen a lot of side effects about it. Now, I just want to ask all the panelists just to contribute to that main, just a few words about the effects of politics in the country. And I know Professor Joe has already spoken it well out loud in terms of America, but politics do play a very important role in this COVID-19 pandemic. It can make or break a country. And that is what we need to address. And politics also in terms of developed and underdeveloped countries is also happening in this COVID-19 pandemic. So Professor James, what is your, because I'm going to take a final, final message from all of you regarding biopower, the role of politics and its effect on public health policies. Your opinion, Professor James.
Yeah, let me say politics plays a bigger role in respect to shaping public health. And because most of the policies, they are being developed, most of the policies are being developed through the power of the politicians. However, the problem we are having with the policies, especially in health policies in the entire Africa, is where you find those policies. They most of the politics. What is normally avoided is they are not being developed using data and evidence. What is happening is that finally you find politics coming in, shaping the policies differently. And that's why you find we are even having a lot of health inequalities within populations, between
inequalities,
countries.
yes. Inequalities.
Yes. And those inequalities, you know, of course, finally they have a lot of impact on public health, and that's why you can see some of diseases like outbreaks occurring more frequently. That is why you can see we are struggling with a lot of other health indicators remaining very low.
Yes, that's right. Because right now, what is happening also is a lot of funds and decisions concerning other diseases other than COVID-19 are being, sidelined and are not being discussed. So that is an issue when it comes, because, we need to address all issues when it comes to public health issues, and not specifically, only the COVID-19 pandemic issue. So that is a very important aspect in terms of politics and public health. Baroness Findlay, your words on biopower and the role of politics in public health policies, shaping the policies with regard to COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think that actually as doctors, as clinical service providers, we have to be very united in the message that we need to be able to collect the data, but we need to understand what's happening with this virus. We need to have proper long-running clinical trials, data collection, because that's the only way we will know what's the right thing to do, and that we must not be used as a political football.
Okay.
When different politicians make claims, then we have to stand up and tell the public, no, these claims are not appropriate. This is a new virus, and we have got to have the funding to collect the information to understand how to manage it going forwards. And I think that's very, very important. And our political message must be behind medical research and clinical services, and not caught in dogma.
Yeah, and the healthcare workforce has a very important role in shaping the public health policies, which I think politicians also should take heed.
But we must be outspoken about it, because otherwise the political messages will make more noise, and that's what the public will hear.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Baroness Philip. Professor Joe, one short message regarding biopower and the role of politics in shaping public health policies?
Well, I think what this pandemic has taught us is that there's differences between being economically developed and ethically developed. And we see that we have pervasive ethically underdeveloped administrations, and that's the importance of these type of groups to bolster that. I agree with Baroness Findlay that it's a responsibility of healthcare leaders to speak up and to advocate for truth and for looking at the data so we can make better decisions.
Okay, just say that phrase again, what you said, ethically underdeveloped.
Ethically underdeveloped.
Okay, that's a new phrase that I'm hearing. It's a very good phrase that to use. Thank you, Professor Joe. Professor Bello? Professor Bello? Ariel can come in too, Professor Bello, the role of politics in shaping public health policies.
Ariel.
Sí, la pregunta es si el rol de la política le está dando una forma a políticas de salud, digamos, o a la salud.
Public health policies.
Sí, políticas de salud pública.
Sí, yo creo que las políticas que se están llevando adelante no están suficientemente asesoradas por especialistas en los distintos niveles, tanto médicos como éticos.
The politics that are being taken are not guided or assessored by, ¿por quiénes?
Okay.
By the medical or, yeah, medical staff.
Medical and ethical.
Okay, ethical. All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bello. Professor Walter?
Yes, so I think, especially in a country like ours, the government plays a very central role in ensuring public health compliance. The challenge is to balance force with persuasion. And I think, as you rightly say, also the issue of diverting some of the resources from the very important areas of public health to a pandemic, because it is a thing that we are seeing. Okay. So one of the problems that we have is that when you do that, we have a lot of silent mortality and morbidity that is ongoing that does not get the attention that you are getting because of a pandemic situation. So it's a balance that the government needs to look critically into. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Walter, I won't let you go because there is a question which apparently you were able to answer regarding the DNA, interference, DNA vaccines. Would you like to, because there's...
yeah, so the concern here is about, yeah, I've seen the post, they're talking about the concern of a DNA vaccine integrating into human DNA and thereby causing issues later on. But that is not correct, because DNA vaccines, sometimes we get the impression that people are thinking that DNA vaccines are being used for the first time in COVID vaccines. We have used DNA vaccine for many years in malaria clinical trials, in HIV clinical trials, in Ebola clinical trials, and there's no evidence that a DNA of a virus or any pathogen that is being used in a vaccine would integrate into human DNA to cause any pathology. So I just needed to clarify that. And then besides that,
at least that would allay the fears of people who think that it's going to integrate into the...
Yeah. And then besides that, I think also people have the impression that all the COVID vaccine candidate vaccines being tried now are DNA-based. They are not DNA-based. There are few that are DNA-based, others are not. Thank you.
Yeah. Few are, because we know that some are based on the spikes and some are based on the envelope and receptors. Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Walter, for clarifying those questions. And Professor Michael, would you like to say something? The final words, Australia and biopower. But Professor Michael, with regard to COVID-19 pandemic, okay?
Well, I think, put simply, governments do not usually relinquish power that they take in times of crisis. We look no further than the erosion of civil rights since the war on terror in the early 20th century. So I think the question of how the exercise of biopower looks in the time of COVID is not a question we're going to be able to answer next week or next year, but perhaps in 5 or 10 years when we look at the precedents that were set in the pandemic.
There is some sort of evidence now. We don't have to wait 10 years. We are seeing, the repercussions of certain decisions that have been taken by the government.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that I think the history tells us that well-intentioned decisions in one political and historical context can become quite malignant and malevolent down the track, whether in Nazi Germany, it's the passage of certain laws about sterilization giving way to mass murder and later genocide. Not saying that this is what's going to happen here, but I think when we look at the very dramatic decisions that have been taken by many, many governments as exercises of coercion.
Give us an example.
Lockdowns, public policy decisions about who gets funded.
Why do you see this as okay, there is an affront to your autonomy, yes, but why do you see it as an exercise of biopower, like excessive use of power?
Well, it is to go back to the the original formulations of a gunman. It creates a state of exception, an extraordinary state of emergency or public health crisis that invites and legitimates coercive power by the state that wouldn't be tolerated by the population in other circumstances. The question is, once they do it now, what are the pretexts in which they're going to do it again?
Okay, but tell me, do we have an alternative to this?
Well, again, it's the issue of what's the next time that a state decides to impose a lockdown or enforce restriction of movement or whatever other violation of negative rights on the pretext of a biological emergency. It's essentially say we've lost many civil rights, privacy, and so on after a crisis about terrorism. The question is begged: what rights will we lose? What will be legitimate and almost mainstream as an exercise of power of the state on someone's biology after this is over? That's what I'm saying. I think that the real interesting point, historical lesson, is that you need to look at well-intentioned and seemingly necessary steps that become misused in a later time.
Okay, all right. Professor Alvin, probably we can end with you. Your last message.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Mary. In fact, I tend to disagree a bit on Professor Michael's view, in a way that human rights sometimes are not absolute. So that is the right to move, the right for social distancing, and the negative mobility rights. I think these are, of course, important, but the elderly people, the vulnerable people, they also have the rights to be prevented to get sick from the pandemic COVID-19. So the society, upon the advice of the medical profession, to have so-called social distancing, also some emergency rules, to have mandatory masking, universal masking. These, yes, limit the rights, some of the rights of people in the society, but then it's not overriding to the basic human rights, I think. It's totally different from the Nazis' order to have the genocide. So if we have such a message in the society, then it would antagonize the united force of the medical profession in advising on the society in all aspects. When the society had a view on the medical profession that we are in fact giving draconian measures to limit human rights and then assimilating to the Nazis' measures, I think that is quite difficult to swallow. In fact, just as Baroness has mentioned, the profession needs to be united in giving advice to the society. And we have such, if we have such polarized opinions from the medical profession to such an extent, then the public would be confused, I think.
It's conflicting messages we're giving to the public.
Yeah. So, of course, we all have the rights to have freedom of speech. We can all have to say so. But then from authoritative medical professors saying something like that, that will really confuse the medical professional views on these public issues. Of course, you have your right to say so. But then I think in Hong Kong, for example, in the third wave, we had over 100 elderly people who had died from the pandemic affecting all these vulnerable people. They got sick because they got infected, and because of all those measures, now the medical profession had advised the government is hoping to prevent these so-called unnecessary deaths of these vulnerable people. So I think we are all speaking from our medical conscience, our human integrity. So when we say so and we advise the government, now how the government implements is not in our control. Sometimes we give the professional advice, but then the government had a very poor techniques in putting it into action, a very poor implementation that, say, for example, would annoy the public, giving all the trouble, unnecessary trouble to the public. That's not our responsibility. But to pushing it to the extent that these draconian measures are like Nazis, then it's really frightening to me.
All right.
I hope you will. Thank you.
So we have both sides views from, but Professor Michael, thank you for your talk, because it has at least, brought about a discussion. I mean, some feel it's extreme, some feel, some probably are, thinking way ahead. So I just want to bring in, before I close, I want to bring in Professor Veronica from Brazil. She has been attending all our webinars. Professor Veronica, are you there? Is she there, Dr. Derek?
Deborah, isn't it?
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I called her Veronica. Deborah, yes.
From the
in my mind, I think she has Veronica is there in her name. Oh, or did I baptize you now? Sorry. Okay, Deborah. Professor Deborah, please. Professor Deborah is from Brazil.
Brazilian medical.
Hello. Good morning here, and good evening for you, for almost of all you.
Professor Deborah, would you like to talk about what is happening in Brazil and politics and health issue?
Yes, it's a pleasure for me. Sorry, because my English is not very good.
That's okay.
I don't speak as good as I
no problem. We have Ariel. Ariel is there to translate. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Here we have a problem now because the cases are decreasing. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Pardon?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. Here we have a big problem. We have a period of elections, and the people are together all time without masks. I'm very worried because I think in the end of the elections, we will have an increase of cases here. It's very, how can I say, I'm worried so much because people don't use masks, but they use masks wrong. They touch in their faces, they put the masks on the neck.
Chin mask on the chin.
I'm worried. I'm worried so much. And here I'm from the Medical Association, Brazilian Medical Association, but here in my state from Paraíba, I work too in the Council of Medicals, Medical Council, and we addicted. I'm addicted booklet from the candidate doctor. We think it's important to take a good ethic to the doctors that are candidates. They have to work in the ethicals because we have to change our health organization in our country and in our cities.
All right.
I think it's important. So we launched that, where various issues are addressed in the light of the ethics. It's very important for the doctors to recognize their importance in the politicians. When politicians, I think it's very important to claim to the politicians that are doctors to be as ethical as it's possible.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That's so true. The healthcare workers, doctors do have a very important role at this point of time in COVID-19 pandemic to be the role model one and to advise the government properly so that correct policies and healthcare reforms and measures can be taken. That's very important. So our plays, I've been just having these webinars and discussing. We know where we stand and what we have to do, and that's very important. I want to thank all our panelists today and Professor Michael too, and for bringing out this concept of biopower. And I'm sure we're all seeing it in some measure or the other in our countries. But we shall hope that we get through this COVID-19 pandemic without much of politics mixing up with health issues, and that all of us can go back to a safe world, and that is what we are all hoping for. So I thank all of you for participating, and thank you for those who have answered the questions of the participants in the chat box. And I hope all of you enjoy the discussions and stay safe and be positive. Thank you very much. Professor Russell, do you want to close?
Yeah, is there anything Derek wants to, Derek, is there anything you want to?
No, I think most of the questions have been answered. Professor Amnon, if
yeah,
you would like
he was
to
there.
say,
he was the silent observer.
He was there
here.
throughout.
Yeah.
If you can,
no,
I don't know whether you can speak.
Yeah.
It would be lovely to hear your.
No. He doesn't want to speak.
Yeah.
He just wants to.
Okay.
He mentioned it before.
Anyway, it's good to have you
He's
here,
coming.
and I'm very honored by your presence.
Professor Kami said he's coming in to show solidarity and to invite everyone for the webinars. Thank you, Professor Kami, for coming.
Thank you, Professor, for being here. Back to you, Dr. Russell.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mary. Thank you very much for the one good moderating that you did, bring out all these issues that contribute to this schism, as it were, between medicine and politics, and to Michael Robertson, who presented issues from his book, where they've gone into the details and got history. So I want to thank you, thank all of you, and thank you, Ilora, Professor Ilora Finlay, for your contribution, not now alone, but continuously. Thank you to Alvin, Dr. Alvin Chan. And it's good that we saw two parts. That you brought the other part, which again, what you said is true. It was not absolute, isn't it? So I think thank you very much for your contribution as a panelist here, and thank you to Professor James for your contribution, and also to Professor Walter, both of you from the African region country of Kenya. And it's very sad. The only thing was due to the poor connectivity. Professor Ravi, who is actually traveling, and he was trying to get us, who's the treasurer of the World Medical.
We would have loved to bring in the Indian perspective, but unfortunately he was not able to join.
And also from the World Medical Association.
Yeah,
that's what I thought would have been good. But anyhow, thank you very much. And Leon Cohen, thank you for your contribution here, and your translator.
Ariel. Thank you, Ariel, and thank you to we will use your services, Ariel.
I think now we can have from the Latin American region, where we have a lot of friends. Yeah, a lot of friends like Leon and so forth, but due to the of Spanish, but now this might be a good way that we have. And we also had Deborah she usually comes to all our meetings from Brazil. So I have to say that the representation that we've had virtually covers most parts of the world, or at least regions of the world, from North America, Latin America, we had UK, and
the
Europe.
Continents.
Yes, and certainly Australia and India, Hong Kong, and Africa. So we are again come back to, as Dr. Mary said, solidarity. That we have a representation from all the world. Many people here I got from Mexico, and have written and joined us. So we're very thankful to all of you to contributing to this important and this issue. And I think this is the solidarity, the way we take it forward, the way we think, we open up thoughts, and this is very important. So thank you once again, and to everyone, and we will see you again. We will be having the next webinar, which will be sending out
Flyers,
flyers and invites again for the 29th one, and we'll confirm that in the next 2 days or so. So once again, thank you, and thank you, Professor Salman, for being there in solidarity with us, and all the others we've got from Sri Lanka, a variety of all the. I'm very delighted that all around 100, but from the whole world, especially.
Yeah, and we also have Tara from
Iraq, yes.
Yeah.
From the
Kurdish region of
Kurdish
Iraq.
region of Iraq. Yeah. So you can see in 100 or around 100 or 90 to 100 people, but we are having such a variety of from all parts of the world, or this globe, which again demonstrates not only the solidarity, but importantly that we are all in this together. Every one of you here, all of us are going through this together, and we are focusing on ethical issues, not only as our difficulties, but we are also bringing the ethical aspects in every one of these webinars. And the UNESCO chair, in particular, the UNESCO chair and Bioethics has contributed tremendously to bringing this 28 webinars, to bring all the countries together, focusing on issues that we're all dealing with and we're all living with. And in the same way, we are very hopeful that we'll all come out of this again to continue. So thank you also to Dr. Derek for the moderator. He's been looking after the chat box. Thank you for that. And Dr. Professor Des Powell from the Melbourne unit of the UNESCO chair, who has been contributing to writing the executive summary, which we have all the recordings and the summary on the Bioethicon website that we maintain this. So any of you can go back and see that. Thank you, Joe. I realize that you've changed your time, and poor Joe, I don't know if you've gone 1 hour earlier or 1 hour later, Joe. What is it?
1 hour earlier. So we started at 6:30, but that's fine.
Oh my
sorry.
goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining.
So
I just forgot the time change.
So what happens to those from Central America? What is the time there? Because if East is 6:30, then the Central, Mexico, Texas,
well, the United States, if they're in Texas, it would be 5:30, and California
so it all
would
goes
be
up 1 hour. Oh my, yeah.
So just in the U.S., yes.
No, we've all had changes. Baroness, she was
okay.
And we've had in Australia, we've gone 1 day. So for us, I start now, it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning.
Last night everybody changed?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Thank you all, and stay safe and stay well till we meet again in the next week or so. The next webinar. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Bye bye. Thank you,
Okay.
Deborah. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Russell,
Yeah,
Dr.
thank you.
Derek, and Dr. Mary.
Good to have you, Professor Deborah.
Okay, thank you. Here is